the saints don't locate her conception as the exact moment that resolved all enmity with the devil. Now, the quote St. Augustine, and this is in Against Julianus, Book 4, paragraph 122. It's only in the Latin, by the way. The English translation doesn't have this matching paragraph number. It states, "We do not deliver Mary to the devil by condition of her birth, but for this reason, because this very condition resolved by the grace of rebirth." Right? So her spiritual baptism. Now, we also see, and just so people are aware, well, I'll get into this. This has to do with the Annunciation. Now, St. Gregory the Illuminator, Homily Theory and the Annunciation. He quotes a apocryphal conversation between the angel Gabriel and the Theotokos. "No longer shall the devil be against you, for where of old that adversary inflicted the wound," i.e. in the womb, "there now first of all does the physician apply the salve of deliverance." Now, let me repeat that. No longer shall the devil be against you, but in the womb, now, there, the physician applies a salve of deliverance. Right? So the Annunciation, the grace of the Annunciation was a sort of healing for her. We're going to unpack what that means. It doesn't mean she had sinned before then. "Where death came forth, there was life now prepared its entrance." Right? So death came from us being born. Psalm 50 speaks that we have sin from our mother. Well, from the womb, from the Theotokos, from that mother, now life comes forth. So, right, it's this undoing of original sin. Now, and again, this undoing doesn't work if you don't have this sort of dichotomy purposely drawn, which is so much of Orthodox theology, or these mirror images against each other. Now, again, to make clear, the Theotokos never in thought or deed sinned. She never conceived of sin in her mind. And by God's grace, she rejected every temptation to sin. God's grace was with her from conception, by the way. All right. So she's had increasing grace from conception and being presented the temple and so on and so forth. But none of this means that the Theotokos was born with an intact prelapsarian tropos. This would defy the incarnational aspect of the atonement confessed in the great Euchologion. I'll use the English pronunciation. Now, salvation is on a spectrum, and grace is applied diversely. People need to understand this, right? There's many mansions in heaven. There's many we attain to different levels of grace. So people could attain to heaven without theosis in this life. There's saints that didn't see the uncreated light, but they are in heaven. Or undoing all the effects of sin. So an example would be that in the hagiographies, there's saints with voluntary deaths and saints with involuntary deaths. Now, a lot of Western Christians aren't even aware there's saints that voluntarily died, but there's actually a whole ton of them that voluntarily died. So we see there are people that go to heaven without attaining to the state of utter spiritual perfection, like those who voluntarily die. So, right, you don't need utter spiritual perfection to go to heaven, and it sure helps, but I don't think anyone listening to this, or you and I, Father, are going to attain to utter spiritual perfection in this life. And so for the Theotokos, the moment of utter spiritual perfection was obviously the Annunciation. Why? Because God became flesh in her. That's the full dose of theosis. Doesn't get any more God than that, right? She actually had God incarnate in her, right? So we'll be divinized by God's grace, by his energies, but we're not going to have God made of our flesh. We can even consume his flesh and blood as we do in the Eucharist. But God is not going to be made of us. She had the full dose of theosis. Mm. So that's why the saints focus on the Annunciation. That's what completely undoes the enemy of the devil. And so the objection removes so much force from what the Orthodox doctrine is, which is why we would find the objection objectionable. I hope laying it out like that kind of makes sense of it all for the audience.
Well, and if I might interject something.
Yes, Father.
Salvation, grace, I think people talk about grace, but there's probably a lot of different ideas here tonight. People listening, what is grace? What is grace? But grace is God himself and the unity and communion in him. And so another way to say it is there's a spectrum of that, obviously, and it doesn't get any, as you said, any more intense or any more full of grace. The Lord is with thee. I mean, that's where we're now arrived at a state that certainly surpasses Eve by a long shot, right? So in understanding our salvation and the Mother of God here, that I think is really important to unpack the meaning of grace, because I think a lot of people think of it in legalistic, moralistic terms. So hopefully that
And
helps.
just so people are aware, Ephesians chapter 3 and Wisdom of Solomon chapter 11 does speak of grace in exactly those terms. This is not some sort of medieval Orthodox idea. Again, the faith has been delivered once and for all. We're just preserving and clarifying that deposit of faith.
Very good.
Now.